On a partly cloudy day in Chicago, TJ Jimenez and his friend Jose Roman were driving around in TJ's Mercedes convertible. Roman filmed their drive on his smartphone while a .22 caliber Mossberg semi-automatic rested against his ankle on the car floor. Meanwhile, Jimenez was armed with a custom-made blue-plated pistol. The car rolled up on a lone man on the sidewalk as he walked on the driver's side. Jimenez confronted the man, then abruptly pulled his gun out, leaned over the door, and fired 2 shots into the man's thighs. If those first bullets didn't work, Jimenez had several more rounds packed in a Gucci luggage bag on the car floor. Minutes later, Jimenez sped away from a group of cops, lights flashing, tires screeching, until he finally crashed his Mercedes and the chase ended with their arrest. Why did Jimenez shoot this man? What did Jimenez tell the man before he shot him? Did the time spent in jail turn this vulnerable teen into a seasoned criminal? Jimenez entered the criminal directory at 13 when he was convicted of murder. The victim was a 19-year-old man named Eric Morro, and on February 3rd, 1993, someone shot him dead on a block in East Chicago. By who? The police weren't sure until they decided to charge Jimenez. On paper, he seemed like the perfect person to convict. Jimenez's uncle introduced him to gang life in Chicago at an early age. The Honorable Judge Christy Burkos took one look at Jimenez and only saw how much he looked like, quote, a little punk who was probably too young to shave but old enough to commit vicious murder. In addition to the profiling by Judge Burkos, a couple of witnesses claimed he was near the murder scene. It was enough to put young Jimenez in prison for 16 years. That was until something remarkable happened. Guards carted Jimenez off to prison in 1993. Then, in 2009, new evidence came to light that proved Jimenez could not have committed the Morro murder. In 2009, an old confession resurfaced, and it wasn't Jimenez's. The confessor's name was Juan Carlos Torres. He was recorded on a tape confessing to the murder 16 years ago. Though it was a clear admission of guilt, the confession was deemed inadmissible by law, and Torres got off scot-free. Torres was also 13. While young Torres was going to school like an average teenager, Jimenez stood in front of 12 people who in '93 voted to convict him of murder. Then not long after, Judge Burkos sentenced Jimenez to 45 years in prison. Jimenez spent 16 years behind bars, starting at the formative age of 13. While most kids are getting ready for high school, learning how to be an adult, dating, playing video games, and taking tests, Jimenez was sent to a state-run youth facility in Illinois. Though he was incarcerated with kids his age, Jimenez was small for 13. His fellow juvenile inmates constantly harassed him and would even jump Jimenez from time to time. Jimenez would later say he suffered from depression at the youth facility. His mental health didn't improve much when he moved to an adult prison after aging out of the juvenile prison at 17. In the adult prison, Jimenez was treated even worse. Jimenez claims both the guards and inmates terrorized him every single day. Eventually, the teenager decided to fight back against the abuse. Unfortunately, Jimenez's toughness backfired. Whenever he fought back against a guard or inmate, he was forced into segregated areas where he spent most of his time without human contact. Jimenez would later say all his anger, depression, and despair spilled over under the confines of solitary. So, whenever he was allowed back into public areas, Jimenez released his emotions on anyone who antagonized him. Jimenez was sent to solitary so often that he spent 4 consecutive years of his sentence all by himself. With all that alone time, Jimenez worked hard on getting a second chance to defend his innocence. For 16 years, Jimenez mailed dozens of letters pleading to lawyers and advocacy groups like the Innocence Project to take his case, arguing that he still has a chance. In 2005, a group of attorneys and law students working for the Northwestern University Bloom Center specializing in wrongful convictions decided to help Jimenez prove his innocence. Sure enough, when the team brought Jimenez's case back to court, the prosecutor's arguments fell apart. The 2 witnesses who said they saw Jimenez at the crime scene recanted their statements. But the nail in the prosecutor's proverbial coffin was the resurgence of Torres' confession. When their evidence disappeared, the courts decided to acquit Jimenez in 2013. He was a free man. Subsequently, the local government felt obliged to pay Jimenez $25 million. Of course, that was only after a lawsuit. The money was supposed to be consolation for taking 16 imperative years away from the 37-year-old. Jimenez went from a convicted murderer destined to be released in middle age to a multi-millionaire in just 1 year. Despite the victory, Jimenez didn't celebrate. He got right to work on building a new life in Chicago. The time Jimenez spent in prison molded him into its image. The people inside, not the bars or the walls, changed Jimenez. but not necessarily for the better. Prosecutors say Jimenez gave his lawyers around half of the $25 million apology payment. As for the other half, most of that went to the Simon City Royals. The Simon City Royals are an old street gang. Their origins date to the 1950s, where the gang grew from greasers decked out in leather jackets to the facial tattooed drug heads you see today. They're a big deal in Chicago, and Jimenez wanted to revitalize the gang, the same gang his family and friends belonged to. His uncles, the only father figures Jimenez had, raised him to follow in their footsteps. And young Jimenez seemed to be cut from the same stone. His criminal activity started while Jimenez was still in elementary school. They were minor offenses like skipping school too many times and taking illegal drugs. His mother, who spent all her time working, was powerless to stop her son from becoming a juvenile delinquent, nor did she have enough money to send him to a better school. Instead, everything he learned came from the Simon City Royals. Given his family's generational involvement with the Royals, Jimenez waltzed back into the gang like a prince returning from war, ready to take back his birthright. Only gangs aren't kingdoms. Jimenez would have to buy his way back into the gang. Jimenez ended up spoiling them like they were his long-lost children, and in a way they were. However, all of the gift-giving came with a price of sorts. Jimenez returned to Chicago with around $13 million, and it was more than enough. He could have bought himself a lovely house, gotten a job, or become an inspirational speaker. He could have settled down with his beautiful girlfriend Jessica and lived out the rest of his days in relative peace. As peaceful as a wrongfully convicted inmate could live. Instead, Jimenez picked up where he left off. Except this time, he was a millionaire. He spent most of his money and time going on massive shopping sprees. Jimenez bought fellow Royal gang members expensive sports cars, including a Mercedes sports car for himself, along with Gucci products, jewelry, and lots of guns. The Simon City Royals looked legit. However, Jimenez demanded more from the Royals. He wanted to turn them into a real gang like Bloods and Crips in California, who like to use bandanas and tattoos to show their gang's pride. Jimenez wanted other gangs to know whenever they were in the presence of a Simon City Royal. So he started offering cash prizes for anyone willing to get the Royals logo tattooed on their face. In addition to the tattoo bonuses, Jimenez also paid recruits to join the gang. Ultimately, Jimenez wanted to create loyalty. With the face tattoo incentives, the fancy cars, designer suitcases, Jimenez bought the Simon City Royals loyalty, making himself one of their leaders. After spending most of his time alone, Jimenez must have felt liberated. He had a family again, people he could talk to and depend on. Jimenez was a royal, possibly the best royal ever. Jimenez had brought the old Chicago gang back to its former glory using his state-funded restitution. Jimenez wanted everyone to know what he'd accomplished. He had a plan, too. His plan involved using social media to show how he would show old enemies, friends, and former gang members that he was the savior of the Simon City Royals. Along with his social media plan, Jimenez also had a list of current and former Royal members he deemed imposters. Authorities found the list in a letter written by Jimenez in Cook County Jail days after the police chase on Belmont Avenue. In the 6-page letter, Jimenez wrote about his plans to make an example of these so-called imposters when he got out again. Jimenez claimed these gang members had accepted money from him but never contributed anything to the gang. Put another way, the imposters were money-grabbing freeloaders. Jimenez wanted to ensure their actions did not go unpunished. One such man who apparently had feigned loyalty was EARL CASTEEL, a former royal who had joined the gang during Jimenez's big payout. When Jimenez pulled up on EARL, the former royal acted friendly towards them until Jimenez pulled out his blue-plated pistol and asked, "Why shouldn't I blast you right now?" Instead of waiting for an answer, he went ahead and pulled the trigger. Then the video cuts to black. During the trial in 2014, the jury watched the video of Jimenez shooting Castile. It didn't take them long to decide a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Jimenez to 9 years in prison. The prosecutors wanted 10. And, just like that, Jimenez was back in prison. He had spent nearly half his life behind bars and would spend the next decade there as well. In a way, he was returning home. However, Jimenez's story traced back to that fateful day in 1993 when the 13-year-old could have been put on a different path. Sadly, life in prison only cemented the gang mentality he'd grown up with. Click here to watch one of these next videos. And let us know whether you think TJ Jimenez should have had his money taken back by the government too.